Hello everybody, and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be diving into an article created by my colleagues Arun and Hongmeng about building a data-driven backend on the TiDB Cloud Data Services. In a previous article, Arun actually did a really good job of explaining what the TiDB Cloud Data Services are and how we can use it to our benefit. Now in this blog, we're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to do a deeper dive where we're going to work through building REST endpoints within the TiDB Cloud Data Services while also constructing a task tracker app. Now, during the process, we're going to be using a couple of different technologies mixed together. So to prepare us properly, we're going to be needing to use Vercel. So if you do not have an account, it is free. Please sign up. We're going to be needing a TiDB serverless cluster. Once again, it is free. If you do not have one, please sign up. And finally, we're going to be incorporating our GitHub personal profile later on in this article as well. So you need to have Vercel, TiDB serverless cluster, and a GitHub account. The first part of this article asks us to either sign in or sign up for a TiDB serverless cluster. If you have not done this already, please proceed. If you have one already, please go ahead and create a brand new cluster for the purposes of this video. For those of you who do not have a cluster, let me walk you through the process. I've logged into TiDB Cloud and I'm going to create a cluster from scratch. As you can see, I'm going to choose serverless. For my particular location, I'm going to choose the East Coast of the United States for a better latency. I'm going to give this cluster a name. And considering our content, I'm going to call it Task Tracker App. I'm also going to be looking at setting my spending limit to 0 to make it free forever. And I don't need to look at any of the advanced settings. On the right-hand side, I can now click Create. And for us, in the background, this cluster is going to be deployed. Now, once this cluster is up and running, at the top right corner, this connect button is going to go from gray to blue. And that means that our cluster is now up and running and available for use. As you can see, the button is now turned blue, and therefore my cluster is now up, running, and as you can see from the status right here, it is also available. Let's go back to the article. Now, as you can see, we have done steps 1 and 2 from the first section. We have signed in, we have created a brand new serverless cluster, and we're now going to move on to the next steps, which is creating the data model. Now, as you can see, there are a couple of steps that we need to do to create our data model. Now, in total, this section has 3 steps, but the third step is hidden a little bit under some of the code we're going to be using later. So I want to make sure that we all read step number 3, where it says select all the statements in the script and execute them by clicking on the run button. If you do not do this, it's going to generate an error. I'll both generate the error and do it the right way to show you what to expect. In our cloud environment, we should choose chat to query. From here, we are now able to copy the code that is in the article and paste it inside of our prompt. As I mentioned earlier, if I do not select everything in accordance with step 3 in the article, this will generate an error. Let's see what happens. As you can see here, there is a query failure because there is an issue with the no database selected. Now, in step 3 of the article, it clearly states select all the statements. So let's do that and rerun the exact same script. Everything has now been selected. I'm going to click on Run. And all of a sudden, everything works as expected. So be careful when you copy and paste that you make sure that you create the extra step of selecting everything before you click on Run for a successful query. Now that we have our cluster up and running, we're now going to create a data app with GitHub integration. As you can see, we're going to select the data service from the left navigation menu and create our data app from there. Before we start creating our data app, let's scroll a little bit down in the article so that we know what else to do other than just clicking on a button. Now, once we have clicked on the Create Data App button, it's going to give us a pop-up, and we are going to have to provide some information within said pop-up. The first thing we need to do is create and configure our standard data app. We're going to give it the name and provide all the information as described. And then we're going to do the optional GitHub connection. Let's start out with creating our to-do app. As we can see in the article, we're supposed to give it the name to-do app. We're going to copy and paste this just for good measure. We're then going to associate it with the proper link data sources. Now in the article, you can see they're using the default of cluster 0. Since I gave it a name earlier, it's going to be the task tracker app. We're seeing that's a standard data app, and the description is this is a task tracking application designed to do a lot of things. So we're going to copy that description to make sure that we have everything in accordance with the article. It's a standard data app. We're going to provide the description. We're then going to choose Connect to GitHub. This is an optional step, but I'm going to do it for the completeness of this video anyway. When we click on the Install on GitHub, it's going to bring us to GitHub where we can log into our personal environments, and we can then proceed to add it to your GitHub. We also want to make sure we authorize, right? After we have it installed on GitHub, we want to make sure we authorize with our GitHub integration. So you want to make sure you provide TiDB Cloud with the proper authorization. Make sure you do this properly. You want to make sure you set this up on the GitHub side before you connect it to your TiDB Cloud. The final steps here are going to give it the proper repository name, branch name, and directory. The great part about this integration with GitHub is if you did it correctly, all those options should be available for you right here. If it is not executed properly, as you can see here, there will be no repositories found. Now, because of this, it means that on the GitHub side, not everything has been completed. It might take you a little bit of extra time to do this, and there is some guidance within this article, but the entire GitHub section itself is going to be your own choice. If you do want to create everything in accordance with the article, please follow steps A through D. It will help you to create everything on GitHub and connect it properly. As I showed you how the installation and the integration with GitHub works, I'm going to actually turn it off completely to make this video easier to move on. Now, since we're not integrating with GitHub, let's click the Create button. As you can see here, step 4 says click the Create button to create your data app. Now, that's what we already did, but we disconnected it from GitHub for this particular video. Now, after the creating of the data app, it's going to tell us we're going to land on a data app homepage. And since it's going to be our first time using it, we have a Getting Started with Data Services tutorial that's also available. However, considering that most of you will probably have already watched the other video, let's move on to the next step. In this section, we're going to start creating some endpoints. More specifically, we're going to create a post, a get, a put, and a delete HTTPS endpoint for our apps. Now, these endpoints are going to help us create, read, update, and delete different operations in the to-dos table. And if we want to look at some more details about creating our endpoints, there is a link to the actual documentation in the article right here that will bring you to the Create Endpoint documentation for PingCap specifically. Let's start with our post endpoint. So the post to-dos endpoint allows you to create a new task on the to-dos table, and the steps are going to be listed right here. So first, let's do a create endpoint on the to-do app that we created earlier. The way we do this is in our UI, you can see the to-do app in your data services available for you. When we click on the plus symbol, it's going to give us the option to either auto-generate an endpoint or create a manual endpoint. Now, as you can see in the article, we're going to create it manually. With that, we're going to give it some information. Let's start with the first step. We're going to click on the plus symbol. We're going to create an endpoint. And from here, we're now going to refer back to the article to make sure we insert all the details required for this endpoint properly. Now, the first thing we want to do is the path is going to be a to-dos path. Next up, we're actually going to start configuring some of the properties. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the properties. We're going to look at the path. The properties, the path is going to be to-dos. Next up, we're going to be looking at the request method. We're going to select post. Next up, we're going to actually configure the SQL statement that we want in association with this post endpoint. So we're going to copy the code listed here. We're going to select everything and replace it with the code provided to us. And as you can already see on the right-hand side of the screen, a whole lot has already changed. We now all of a sudden have some parameters that are available to us. Let's refer back to the article to make sure we enter the parameters correctly. Now, step 4 talks about these parameters. The parameters are basically going to be the variables that are going to allow us to incorporate some flexibility to the endpoint, right? They're automatically generated, but we can make adjustments that will be catered to our specific needs if we have them. We want to make sure that we set required to make a parameter mandatory. And you also want to align your parameter types to match your data model. Since we're not setting any specific parameters for the post endpoint, we have now completed the endpoint creation. Next up are going to be the other endpoints of get, put, and delete. Now, those endpoints, as you can see from the screen, require more settings. So we're going to get to them individually. So the get endpoint is going to be tasked with retrieving all tasks stored within our to-dos table. Now, if we follow the steps on screen, we'll successfully be able to create the get endpoint just like we created the post endpoint previously. Let's start with step 1. Navigate to the properties, enter the path as to-dos, select the request method to get. Let's add an endpoint. We're going to go to the properties. It's going to be a /to-dos, and then we want to follow the final step, and that means adding the command into our prompt. Now, the get to-dos endpoint also does not require any parameters to be entered. Therefore, we have completed this task. The third endpoint we're going to be creating is going to be the put endpoint. This one does require a little bit more work. So let's make sure we pay attention to the parameters that are listed below. First of all, let's create our put endpoint. Now, as you can see, the steps to creating your endpoints is the same for every single endpoint. The differences lie in either the parameters or in the actual SQL script that we want to put into the SQL editor. Now, in this case, we are going to copy the entire thing. We're going to put it right into our editor. And now we're going to start looking at some of the parameters. To make sure I do this properly, I'm going to refer back to the article to make sure I do not miss any parameters required to make this a successful app. As we can see, we have to set the ID parameter as required. We also want to change its type from the default string to a number. Now, this is going to align with the ID field's type that we created in our to-dos table earlier. This has to be required. As you can see, it has now been ticked off. We're going to change the string to number, and we have now created a successful endpoint again. The final endpoint is going to be our delete endpoint. So let's start creating that one as well. Now, the delete endpoint, just like everything else, really easy to start. We're going to copy the SQL script that we need for later. Besides adding the SQL content and creating the endpoint, we do have to create some of the parameters that are going to make this successful. So first of all, we're going to find the ID parameter, just like we did previously. We have to set it as required. We're going to change the string to a number, just like we did in the previous endpoint. We've now successfully created all 4 of the endpoints required by this article to run our app successfully. But in order for us to be able to confirm that we actually did everything the right way, we need to run some tests on the endpoints. The testing of the endpoints is going to be crucial because if your endpoints don't work properly, your app is not going to work properly. So make sure you spend enough time on this section of the article to confirm that everything you've done up to this point is able to execute as you expect it to. So in this case, we're going to start with the post to-dos. So in the endpoints list, select the post to-dos. So in order for us to test this properly, we have to enter some test values in the parameter section of our post endpoint. Otherwise, we cannot test this. So we have 3 items that we're asked to enter. First, we're going to enter pay internet bill for task. We're going to input May internet bill for description, and we're going to enter incomplete for status. So down here at the bottom right, you can see task. Now, first of all, we were told to say pay internet bill is going to be the actual task, and I like to copy and paste because that way everything is in accordance with the article. Next up is the May internet bill in terms of the description. And then we, of course, have our incomplete as our status. Now, after entering all 3 of these options, right, we're then going to click on the test, right? So we configured these test values. We're going to click on the test button in the upper right corner of our screen to confirm that everything works. Now, in accordance with the article, it says upon executing the test, you should receive a HTTP response with a status code 200. This will indicate a successful test of the post to-dos endpoint. In the same way, we can also validate the remaining endpoints to ensure overall robustness and reliability of our application. Let's start with the test, shall we? As you can see here, the HTTP response is indeed code 200, just like the article told us it would be. Therefore, we can confirm our post endpoint has been successfully created. Please proceed and test all the other endpoints to make sure that everything is as you expected. After you have completed your thorough testing of your endpoints, you now want to make them accessible to external clients. This is going to allow us to connect to our task tracker app. So let's look at how we can deploy each endpoint. On the top right-hand corner of our TiDB serverless environment, we have the deploy button. When you click on the deploy button, a review changes dialog is going to pop up for you. Now, as you can see in the article, we do ask you to perform a final verification of all the edits that you've performed to ensure that everything you've done up to this point has been configured correctly. After you've done all this verification, you can click on the Deploy and Push to GitHub button if you have it integrated with GitHub. This is going to make the endpoint publicly available and pushes the changes to your GitHub repository. Let's start by clicking on the Deploy button. Now, as you can see here, as I mentioned earlier, all the changes that might have happened or that you have applied will be listed here, and it is required for you to just verify that everything is as you expected. Now, I can see that everything that I expect from here is as it should be. I'm therefore going to click on the Deploy button right here. I'm also going to do the same for all the other endpoints. Once you've completed deploying all your endpoints, let's return to the article. One of the main differences I want to point out, and I had mentioned this earlier, if you are not connecting your GitHub repository to your TiDB serverless environment, the button Deploy and Push to GitHub will not look like this. It will just say Deploy. That said, if you have incorporated your GitHub connection, then you want to make sure that you can verify that the backend/HTTP_endpoints folder, which you configured earlier, will contain the configuration files for the deployed endpoints. Now that we've deployed our endpoints, we first have to create an API key, right? Because we can't explore our endpoints without setting up the API key for secure authentication. Let's go through the steps to create our own personal API key. The first step here is to click on the To-Do app and then navigate to the Data Apps homepage. From there, we want to select Settings, and within the settings, we want to look for the Authentication section and click the Create API Key. Now, when we click on the Create API Key, we see a pop-up window which is going to ask us for a description and a role. Now, the description is going to be Task Tracker Key. The role is going to be Read and Write. And from there, we're going to generate a public key and a private key. We need to copy and securely store both these keys in a safe and easily accessible place for later on. Once we have done that, we'll click on Done, and we can then return to the Data App home screen. Let's go through the process. We click on our To-Do Data App. Then we look in Settings, and inside of Settings, we go to Authentication. All the way on the right-hand side, you can see that I can create my API key, which is going to generate that pop-up that we mentioned earlier. Once you've entered that information, we're going to click on Next. We can now see that we have a public key and a private key. Please copy these and store them in a secure location because we will need them later on. Once you've copied the public and the private key to a secure location, we can click on the Done button. By creating the API key, you can now see down in the authentication section of the settings that we have a key, both public and private. We have a description, the status is active, it never expires, the role says Read and Write, and we can also see when we created it. Next up, now that we're done testing our endpoints and deploying them, we are going to explore the endpoints that we've created. Now, with your API key in place, we can utilize the functionality of these endpoints properly. There's two primary methods to be able to achieve this. One is going to be the API docs. The other one is going to be Postman. Now, for the purpose of this video, we're going to follow along with the article. And the article actually used the API documentation through Swagger UI. Now, if you want to have some details on the Postman integration, you can click on the documentation link provided in the article. We, on the other hand, in this video are going to move forward without clicking on the documentation. Now, as we've learned with multiple things in this article, let's read the steps before we start executing to make sure that we don't miss any. So first it says on the Data app homepage, click the View API Docs. This API Docs window is going to pop up and present the API documentation generated through Swagger UI. Now, in the top right corner, we're going to click the Authorize button to authorize the endpoint access. This is going to use the API keys that we created in the previous step. So we want to enter both the public key as the username and the private key as the password so that we can actually authorize properly. Once we have proceeded through that, it concludes the process of creating the backend application for this article. We can now create, retrieve, update, and delete data in the to-dos table using the secure endpoints through the post, get, put, and delete methods. So step 1, let's click on the API Docs. Fantastic, we've been able to open the to-do app. Let's proceed with the authorized steps that were indicated in the article. For those of you who have the information readily available, please proceed to enter all the information as you copied it and stored it from the previous steps. We want to use the public key for our username, and we're going to use the private key for our password. After you've entered them, we're going to click on Authorize. So we have the basic auth available for us, right? We are actually authorized. We gave the public key as our username and the private key as our password. Now, since we're authorized, we can just close this and we can move on from here. So we've come to the final step in this process where we're going to try to visualize the task tracker with Vercel. For those of you who are already familiar with Vercel, please proceed. For those of you who are not, please click on the Vercel's documentation link to get some proper understanding of what it is and how to use it. So we have a couple of steps where you can integrate the front-end code by following these steps to copy the front-end code to your own repository. We can configure a Vercel project, right? Because after we've integrated the front-end code, now we have to actually configure your Vercel project. Then we got to deploy the Vercel project and see if everything works. The first item is to integrate front-end code. As you can see here, this brings us to GitHub. Now, from here, you can see that there are plenty of different explanations on how to do all these things. It's going to guide you through all the steps required in order for you to create this project on your GitHub and how you can connect it to Vercel. Now, if we close this tab and we then click on step 2, configure your Vercel project, you can see that it will bring you to the same article, just a different location. All right. So the steps indicated here, these steps, configure your Vercel project and deploy your project, will all guide you to the same place. So you don't have to click on it 3 times. Now, as you get through the article and as you get through the GitHub, you'll see that everything is meant to make it easier for you. Because the main difference here versus what we saw earlier is the task tracker app is different than our to-do app, right? Our to-do app is just a very simple put, post, get, and delete. But our task tracker app is something that looks a lot nicer. So once we have all the configurations in place, we can deploy the Vercel project and we can see it in action live. To deploy, all we have to do is click the deploy button in Vercel and wait a couple of minutes for the deployment to succeed, and it will look roughly like what you're seeing on screen. Now, once you have this all successfully done, you can start going through some of the processes where you click continue to dashboard, and that will get you your Vercel app domain set up. And then you can click visit to access the UI for the task tracker application itself. And you can enter, remove, and update certain tasks in the to-dos table. So for everybody who wants to proceed with that, I encourage you all to do so. So the conclusion of this article indicates that the TiDB Cloud Data Services offers you a user-friendly, scalable, and reliable platform for application building as well as application management. It showcased in this guide that TiDB Cloud Data Services enables swift creation of CRUD endpoints, facilitating rapid application development and deployment. The main takeaways for me from this article is that it's not only easy to use the TiDB Cloud Data Services, it's very easy to get your basic applications up and running within a very reasonable time. It's also very easy to create your basic endpoints, and you can run a lot of things through this process in a very short amount of time. This creates a very valuable development process for me as an individual because now I can do a lot of things super fast, and I can use low code for my developing process. It provides me with some really valuable tools, options, and directions to investigate. I would like to motivate everybody to go through this article yourself, create your own TiDB Cloud serverless deployment, go through the process, and see how it feels. My second recommendation here is to also integrate with your GitHub so that you can look at the Vercel deployment or an alternate version if you prefer. All in all, this was a great article by my colleagues. This was valuable for me as an individual, and I hope it's valuable for all of you. Thank you for joining in, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a wonderful day.